At 57, Eli Garner figured his heart had given all it had to give. 15 years of empty coffee cups and silent suppers in a house that once rang with his young wife's laughter had taught him that some losses carve permanent hollows in a man's chest. The weathered rancher went to the livestock auction looking for a decent milk cow, not redemption. But sometimes mercy arrives wearing the most unexpected face. When he saw Maura Kelly standing barefoot beside her twin daughters, offered up like chattel to pay a dead man's debts, something stirred in Eli's chest that he'd thought buried with his wife. One impulsive decision would bring 3 broken souls to his failing ranch, where winter winds carry both bitter cold and the possibility of healing. But can a man who's spent 15 years guarding his heart learn to open it again when danger rides back to collect what it believes it's owed? The wedding ring caught the morning light as Eli Garner wrapped his weathered fingers around his coffee mug, the simple gold band he'd worn for 22 years, now loose on his thinner finger. Sarah would have scolded him for losing weight again, would have filled his plate with biscuits and gravy until he couldn't refuse another bite. But Sarah had been gone 15 years come next month, along with the child they'd never gotten to hold. The Broken Arrow Ranch stretched out before him through the kitchen window, 800 acres of Montana grassland that had been in the Garner family for 3 generations. His grandfather had built the main house with his own hands in 1923. Solid pine logs chinked with river clay, a wraparound porch that caught the evening breeze just right. The barn still stood proud, though its red paint had faded to rust in places, and the corrals held good fencing, despite a few posts that needed replacing. But the ranch felt too big for one man now, too quiet. The silence had weight to it, pressing down on his shoulders like an old coat that no longer fit right. Eli could go days without hearing his own voice, except to talk to the handful of cattle that remained, or to curse when something broke, and he had to fix it alone. He'd been 28 when he married Sarah Mitchell, the school teacher's daughter, with honey-colored hair and a laugh that could make the darkest day seem bright. They'd planned to fill this house with children, to hear small feet running through the halls and young voices calling from the porch. Sarah had gotten pregnant twice in their first 5 years of marriage, but both babies came too early, too. Small to survive more than a few hours in this hard world. Then came the pregnancy that lasted 8 months. Sarah had been so careful, resting when the doctor ordered it, eating all the right foods, praying harder than Eli had ever seen anyone pray. They'd painted the nursery yellow, since they wanted the sex to be a surprise, had picked out names for both a boy and a girl. The hand-carved cradle still sat in Eli's workshop, unfinished after all these years, the wood smooth from his occasional touch, but never completed. The fever took Sarah 3 days after Christmas, the baby still a month from being due. Doc Peterson had done everything he could, but infection had set in, and medicine could only do so much in those days. Eli had held her hand as she slipped away, promising her things he'd never been able to keep, that he'd be happy again, that he'd find someone else to love, that he wouldn't let grief make him bitter. He'd kept the first 2 promises about, as well as a screen door, holds water. The town of Cedar Falls lay 12 miles east of the ranch, a community of 800 souls who'd learned to depend on each other through harsh winters and dry summers. Eli knew every family, had gone to school with most of the men his age, had watched their children grow up and start families of their own. But knowing folks and feeling connected to them were 2 different things entirely. Martha Henderson at the general store always asked after his health and pressed extra supplies on him when she thought he wasn't eating enough. Pastor Williams stopped by monthly to check on his soul, though Eli had stopped attending regular services years ago. His nearest neighbor, Tom Brennan, still invited him for Sunday dinner with his wife and 3 daughters, invitations Eli accepted just often. Enough to avoid being rude, but declined, frequently enough to keep from being a burden. The problem wasn't that people didn't care. The problem was that caring felt like work now, like putting on Sunday clothes when you'd rather stay in your old jeans. Eli had grown comfortable in his solitude, the way a man grows comfortable in a favorite chair. It might not be the best thing for him, but it fit his shape. This particular morning, October wind rattled the kitchen windows, and reminded him that winter would arrive early this year. The small herd of cattle he kept would need hay, and his last milk cow had died of old age in September. He needed livestock, but his bank account had been lean since the price of beef dropped and stayed down. A monthly auction in Cedar Falls might offer some bargains. If he was careful with his spending. Eli finished his coffee and reached for the work jacket hanging by the door. His reflection in the hallway mirror showed a man who'd aged more in the past 5 years than in the previous 10. Gray had overtaken the brown in his hair. Lines mapped the corners of his eyes like dry creek beds, and his shoulders carried a stoop that hadn't been there when Sarah was alive. But his hands were still steady, his back still strong enough for wrench work, and his mind sharp enough to spot a good deal when he saw one. The drive to town took him past fields where neighbors had already finished their harvest, stubbled wheat catching the autumn light like scattered gold. He passed the cemetery where Sarah rested under a simple granite stone, her name and dates carved clean and deep. He used to stop there every week, and every month, then only on special occasions. Not because he loved her less, but because talking to stone felt like talking to silence, and he had enough silence at home. Cedar Falls had grown since his childhood, but not by much. Main Street still hosted the same businesses: Henderson's General Store, Miller's Feed and Grain, the Cattleman's Bank where old Mr. Jameson had approved Eli's first loan 30 years ago. The auction barn sat on the outskirts of town, a sprawling complex of pens and loading chutes, where ranchers gathered monthly to buy and sell whatever they needed to make their operations work. Eli parked his pickup between 2 newer trucks, both of them shinier than his 20-year-old Ford. He recognized most of the vehicles in the lot, knew which ranchers favored which livestock, who had money to spend, and who was struggling like him to make ends meet. The auction drew buyers from 3 counties, some looking for breeding stock, others hoping to find a bargain on animals they could fatten and resell. The auction barn buzzed with conversation, men in warm jeans and work boots discussing cattle, prices and weather forecasts while they waited for the sale to begin. Eli nodded to familiar faces, exchanged brief greetings about rain and hay prices, but kept his own company mostly. He found a seat in the middle section where he could see the animals clearly without drawing attention to his bidding. The auctioneer, Pete Murdoch, had been calling sales for 20 years, his voice carrying over the crowd with practiced ease. The first lots were standard fare, a handful of yearling steers, 2 bred heifers, a young bull with good bloodlines. Prices ran higher than Eli had hoped, and he kept his hands folded in his lap, waiting for something within his reach. Came the unusual lots, the miscellaneous items that sometimes included surprises. Pete's voice took on a different tone when he announced the next sale, something uncomfortable creeping into his usual smooth patter. Eli looked up from his catalog to see a woman and 2 children being led into the selling ring. The woman was maybe 30, thin as a fence post, with dark hair pulled back in a simple braid. Her dress was clean but worn, the kind of garment that had been mended more than once. She walked barefoot, her feet pale against the dirt floor of the auction ring. Beside her, twin girls who couldn't have been more than 8 years old held each other's hands, their freckled faces wide with fear. Pete Murdoch cleared his throat, the microphone crackling with feedback. Next lot is settlement of debts for the estate of Dennis Kelly. We have his widow, Maura Kelly, and her twin daughters, Lily and Rose. Opening bid is $200 to satisfy gambling debts owed to Jake Morrison. The words hit Eli like a physical blow. In all his years attending auctions, he'd never seen anything like this. Around him, men shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some shaking their heads, others muttering under their breath. But no one stood to leave, and no one spoke up to stop what was happening. Maura Kelly kept her chin raised, but Eli could see the tremor in her hands as she held her daughters close. The girls pressed against their mother's sides, 2 small faces peering out at the crowd with the wide-eyed terror of cornered animals. One of them, he couldn't tell which in the harsh lights, had tears tracking silently down her cheeks. Now, folks, Pete continued, his discomfort obvious, this is a legal proceeding to settle legitimate debts. The deceased owed substantial money for gambling losses, and the creditor has rights under territorial law to recover what's owed. A man in an expensive suit stood near the front row, arms crossed over his chest. Jake Morrison had the look of someone who collected debts for a living, cold eyes, hard mouth, clothes that cost more than most ranchers made in a month. He nodded when Pete mentioned his name, a satisfied expression on his face, like he was watching justice being served. But this wasn't justice. This was something else entirely, something that made Eli's stomach turn and his hands clench into fists. He thought of Sarah, how she'd volunteered at the church to help families in need, how she'd never turned away anyone who came to their door looking for help. He thought of the empty house waiting for him, the silence that had become his only companion, the slow erosion of hope that had left him feeling like a shell of the man he used to be. The bidding started low, hesitant voices calling out numbers, while the woman and her daughters stood in the center of the ring like livestock. Eli felt his heart hammering against his ribs, felt the wedding ring sliding loose on his finger as his hands began to sweat. Every instinct told him to stay seated, to keep his money in his pocket, to avoid complications that could upend the careful balance of his solitary life. But then one of the little girls rose. He thought looked directly at him across the crowd, her blue eyes meeting his with such desperate hope that it nearly stopped his breath. In that moment, she looked exactly like Sarah had the day she'd asked him to marry her, hopeful and terrified and brave all at once. Eli's hand moved almost without his permission, rising into the air as his voice called out a bid that would change. Everything the auction paddle trembled in Eli's hand as he approached the ring where Mara Kelly stood with her daughters. Up close, the woman looked even more fragile than she had from his seat, dark circles under green eyes that held too much. Weariness for someone barely 30 years old. The twins pressed close to their mother's sides, mirror images of each other, except for the way they carried themselves. One bold enough to meet his gaze, the other hiding behind a curtain of reddish-brown hair. "Ma'am," Eli said, removing his hat out of habit. "I'm Eli Garner. I run a ranch about 12 miles west of here." Mara Kelly studied him with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read danger in men's faces. Whatever she saw seemed to reassure her slightly, because her shoulders relaxed just a fraction. "Mr. Garner, I'm Mora, and these are my daughters, Lily and Rose." The bolder twin Rose, he thought, stepped forward slightly. "Are you going to hurt us?" The question hit Eli like a physical blow. That a child would even need to ask such a thing told him more about their recent life than he wanted to know. "No, sweetheart, I'm not going to hurt any of you. I'm going to take you somewhere safe." Lily, the quieter twin, whispered something to her mother that Eli couldn't catch. Mora nodded and smoothed the girl's hair with a gentle hand. "She wants to know if we'll have enough to eat." Eli's throat tightened. When had he last worried about his next meal? When had he last seen hunger in a child's eyes? "You'll have plenty to eat. I promise you that." Jake Morrison appeared at Eli's shoulder like a bad smell, his expensive suit out of place among the ranchers and farmers. "Mr. Garner, isn't it? I trust you understand the terms of this transaction. The woman and children are your responsibility. Now, any future debts, any problems they cause, that's on you." "The debts died with her husband," Eli said, meeting Morrison's cold stare. "As for problems, I don't expect any." Morrison's smile had no warmth in it. "You'd be surprised what kind of problems can follow a woman like that." Dennis Kelly wasn't particular about who he owed money to, if you catch my meaning. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Eli felt anger rising in his chest, the kind of protective fury he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. "Are you suggesting there might be other claims on Mrs. Kelly?" "I'm suggesting you might want to keep your eyes open. Montana's a big territory, but word travels fast about interesting transactions." Morrison tipped his hat with mock courtesy. "Good day, Mr. Garner. Enjoy your purchase." Mora's face had gone pale during the exchange, and her hands shook as she gathered her daughters closer. "Mr. Garner, if there are going to be more men like him—" "There won't be," Eli said with more confidence than he felt. "You're under my protection now. All of you." The walk to his truck felt like running a gauntlet. Eli could feel eyes following them, hear whispered conversations that stopped when he looked in their direction. Some of the attention came from curiosity, but some carried judgment. By nightfall, half the county would know that Eli Garner had spent his last $1,000 on a woman and 2 children at auction. His truck looked even more battered next to the newer vehicles in the lot. Eli opened the passenger door and helped Maura into the front seat before assisting the twins into the back. Neither girl spoke during the loading, but he noticed they kept their hands clasped together like anchors in a storm. The drive back to the ranch passed in uncomfortable silence. Eli searched for something to say that might ease the tension, but what words could possibly address the strangeness of their situation? He'd bought them like livestock, bringing strangers home to a house that hadn't sheltered children in 15 years. Maura stared out the passenger window at the passing landscape, her face unreadable. The twins whispered to each other in the back seat, their voices so low he couldn't make out words. When they passed the cemetery where Sarah rested, Eli felt an odd sensation, as if his wife's spirit was watching this unlikely caravan with amused approval. The Broken Arrow Ranch looked shabbier than usual as they approached, the peeling paint and sagging fence posts more obvious through strangers' eyes. Eli parked near the front porch and killed the engine, suddenly aware of how quiet the place was without wind to rattle the barn doors. "It's not much," he said, "but it's solid. Warm. The roof doesn't leak, and there's always food on the table." Rose, definitely. The bolder twin leaned forward between the front seats. "Do you have any animals?" "Some cattle. A few chickens. Used to have a milk cow, but she died last month. That's actually why I was at the auction." The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd gone looking for livestock and come home with a family instead. Maura opened her door and stepped out, helping her daughters from the back seat. They stood close together in the ranch yard, 3 figures. That looked impossibly small against the vast Montana sky. Lily pointed toward the barn, where a few chickens pecked in the dirt near the open doors. "Can we see the chickens?" she asked, speaking directly to Eli for the first time. "After we get you settled," he said. "Let's go inside first." The front door stuck slightly. It always did in damp weather, and Eli had to put his shoulder into it. The door gave way with a groan, opening onto the main room where dust motes danced in afternoon sunlight. The space felt different with people in it, less like a mausoleum and more like what it was supposed to be, a home. "There are 3 bedrooms upstairs," Eli said, leading them through the main room toward the staircase. "You can take your pick. The master bedroom has its own fireplace, if you get cold at night." Maura touched his arm, stopping him at the foot of the stairs. "Mr. Garner, I need to ask you something directly. What do you expect from us, from this arrangement?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications he hadn't fully considered. What did he expect? He'd acted on impulse, driven by compassion and outrage rather than any clear plan. "I expect you to be safe," he said finally. "I expect your daughters to have enough to eat and a warm place to sleep. Beyond that, we'll figure it out as we go." "And in return?" Eli looked at the twins, who were listening to every word with the intense focus of children, who'd learned that adult conversations often determined their fate. "In return, you live here. Help out with whatever you can. Be a family. I suppose even if it's not the traditional kind." Maura's eyes searched his face for deception or hidden motives. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded slowly. "The girls and I can share a room. We're used to staying close together. You don't have to." "We do," she said firmly. "For now, anyway, until we know how this is going to work." Eli showed them to the largest of the guest bedrooms, a corner room with windows facing both east and south. The bed was big enough for 3, and there was a comfortable chair near the window where someone could sit and watch the sunrise. The room had been Sarah's sewing room before she died, the place where she'd made curtains and mended clothes and planned the nursery they'd never used. "This is beautiful," Maura said, running her hand along the quilt Sarah had made during their second winter of marriage. "Your wife had good taste. How did you know I was married?" Maura glanced at his left hand, where the wedding ring caught the afternoon light. "You still wear your ring. And this house has a woman's touch in the details. Way the furniture's arranged, the colors she chose." She loved you very much." The observation was delivered with such gentle understanding that Eli felt his chest tighten. Yes, she did. Rose had discovered the window seat and was peering out at the ranch yard below. "Mama, look." "You can see everything." From here, Lily joined her sister at the window, both girls kneeling on the cushioned seat to get a better view. Their presence transformed the room in ways Eli couldn't quite define, filling spaces that had been empty for too long. "There's a bathroom just down the hall," he said. "Clean towels in the linen closet. I'll let you get settled while I fix something for supper." In the kitchen, Eli stared into his nearly empty refrigerator and tried to figure out how to feed 3 additional people with what he had on hand. Some eggs from his chickens, bread that was only a day old, a can of beans that had been sitting in his cupboard since summer. It wasn't much, but it would have to do until he could get to town for proper groceries. As he cooked, he could hear voices upstairs, Mora's low murmur, answering her daughter's excited chatter. The sounds were foreign in his house, but not unwelcome. For the first time in 15 years, the Broken Arrow Ranch felt alive. When he called them down for supper, all 3 appeared in the kitchen doorway as a unit, the twins flanking their mother like small guards. They'd washed their faces and hands, and someone had braided the girls' hair into neat plaits. They looked less like refugees and more like a family preparing to sit down to dinner. "Smells good," Mora said, though Eli knew his simple scrambled eggs and beans were nothing special. They ate in relative quiet, the twins taking small, careful bites as if they weren't sure the food would keep coming. Eli found himself studying their faces, looking for signs of illness or injury beyond the obvious malnutrition. Both girls were too thin, their wrists fragile as bird bones, but their eyes were bright and alert. "Mr. Garner," Rose said during a lull in the conversation, "what happened to your family?" "Rose," Mora scolded, "that's not polite." "It's all right," Eli said. "My wife died 15 years ago. We never had children." "Why not?" Lily asked, her curiosity overcoming her shyness. "Sometimes things just don't work out the way you plan." "Them," Eli said. "But maybe this is the way things were supposed to happen. Maybe you were supposed to come here." Mora looked up from her plate, something unreadable in her expression. "Do you really believe that?" Eli considered the question seriously. Did he believe in fate, in divine providence, in the idea that suffering might have purpose? He'd stopped believing in most things after Sarah died, but sitting at his kitchen table with these 3 strangers who were no longer quite strangers, he felt something stirring that might have been faith. "I'm starting to," he said. Dawn came earlier than Eli expected, announced by small footsteps on the stairs and whispered conversations in the kitchen. He'd been awake for an hour anyway, staring at the ceiling and wondering what he'd gotten himself into. 15 years of solitary mornings had taught him to rise with the sun, but the sounds of other people stirring in his house felt like a dream he couldn't quite shake out when he made his way downstairs. He found Mora at the kitchen sink, washing the dishes from last night's supper. She'd braided her dark hair back and found an apron somewhere, probably the one Sarah used to wear, hanging forgotten in the pantry. The sight of it brought an unexpected pang, not of grief exactly, but of recognition. Life continuing, purposes being served. "You don't need to do that," he said. "I need to do something," she replied without turning around. "The girls are still sleeping, and I'm not good at sitting idle." Through the window, Eli could see Rose, definitely the earlier riser, exploring the chicken coop with the fearless curiosity of childhood. She'd found the old feed bucket and was scattering corn with more enthusiasm than accuracy, sending the hens into a frenzy of excited clucking. "Rose seems to have made friends with the chickens," he observed. Mora smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "She's always been drawn to animals. Gets it from her father, I suppose, though Dennis never had much patience for anything that couldn't turn a profit." The mention of her late husband brought a shadow across her face, and Eli felt the familiar awkwardness of not knowing how to navigate someone else's grief. His own mourning had been a solitary affair, conducted in the privacy of empty rooms and sleepless nights. What happened to him? He asked, then immediately regretted the question. "I'm sorry. That's not my business. It's all right. If we're going to live here, You should know. Maura dried her hands on the dish towel, movements careful and deliberate. Dennis had a sickness for gambling. Started small card games with neighbors, bets on horse races. But it grew worse after the girls were born. He'd disappear for days at a time, come home with empty pockets and wild stories about the next big win that would solve all our problems. She moved to the window, watching Rose chase chickens around the yard, with Lily now joining in the fun. The last time he left, he was gone for 2 weeks. When he came back, he was different, scared. Said he'd gotten in deep with some men from back east, men who didn't forgive debts. 3 days later, they found him in the river. And Morrison came collecting. Not right away. At first, there were just rumors, people saying Dennis owed money all over the territory. Then Morrison showed up with papers, documents that proved Dennis had signed over his family as collateral for his gambling debts. Her voice remained steady, but Eli could see her hands trembling. Apparently, it's legal under territorial law. A man's property includes his wife and children. The casual brutality of it struck Eli like a physical blow. He'd known the law was different out here, more primitive than in the established states, but he'd never imagined it could be used to essentially sell human beings. Well, those papers don't mean anything now. You're free of all that, am I? Maura turned from the window, her green eyes serious. Mr. Garner, I appreciate what you did yesterday more than I can say. But men like Morrison don't give up easily. He paid money for those papers, and he expects a return on his investment. Before Eli could respond, the kitchen door burst open as both twins tumbled inside, cheeks flushed from the cool morning air and arms full of fresh eggs. Rose held up her collection proudly. Look what we found. The chickens made them just 4. You? Lily, still more reserved, but warming up, added, the red hen, let me pet her. She's very soft. Careful with those eggs, Maura warned. And wash your hands before breakfast. As the girls bustled around the kitchen sink, chattering about their discoveries, Eli marveled at how quickly they'd adapted to their new surroundings. Children were resilient in ways adults never were, able to find joy even in the midst of upheaval. Can we help with the other animals today? Rose asked as she dried her hands. Do you have horses? Just one, Eli said. An old gelding named Buck. He's mostly retired now, but he still likes company. Can we ride him? Rose, Maura cautioned, don't impose on Mr. Garner's kindness. It's not an imposition, Eli said, surprised to find he meant it. Buck would probably enjoy the attention. Been a long time since he's had children around. They spent the morning touring the ranch, Eli showing his unexpected guests the layout of barns and corrals, explaining the rhythm of ranch life in terms simple enough for 8-year-olds to understand. The twins absorbed everything with the intensity of students, asking questions about cattle feeding schedules and why the fences needed regular repair. Maura followed slightly behind, observing but not participating much in the conversation. Eli caught her studying the property with an appraising eye, noting which structures needed attention and which areas showed signs of neglect. When they passed a section of fence where 2 posts had pulled loose from their moorings, she stopped and examined the damage closely. This could be fixed easily enough, she said. Just needs new wire and someone to reset the posts properly. I know. I've been meaning to get to it, but, Eli shrugged. Always something else that seems more urgent. I could do it. I'm handy. With repairs, the offer surprised him. Most women he knew wouldn't even notice a broken fence, much less volunteer to fix it. You know how to mend fencing? I know how to do a lot of things. Had to learn with Dennis gone so much. There was no bitterness in her voice, just the practical acceptance of someone who'd learned to rely on herself. If we're going to stay here, I want to earn my keep. That afternoon, while the twins napped in their shared room, Maura proved her. Words by attacking the broken fence with tools she'd found in the barn. Eli watched from the kitchen window as she worked, marveling at her efficiency and skill. She reset the posts with competent precision, stretched new wire tight and true, and secured the connections with the experienced hands of someone who'd done this work before. When she finished, the repair looked better than some of Eli's own work. The realization brought an unexpected feeling, not quite guilt, but a recognition that he'd let things slide over the years, allowed his property to reflect his own declining spirits. "Looks good," he said when she returned to the house. "Tool. Belt slung over her shoulder. It'll hold through the winter. There are 2 more sections that need attention before the snow flies, and the barn door has a hinge that's working loose." Eli poured coffee for both of them, noting the way Maura's face had relaxed during the physical work. "You didn't have to do that, you know. Fix the fence." "Yes, I did." She accepted the coffee cup gratefully, wrapping her hands around its warmth. "Mr. Garner, I need you to understand something. I've spent the last 8 years feeling helpless, watching my husband gamble away everything we had while I sat by, because wives aren't supposed to interfere with their husbands' decisions. I won't live like that again." "I wouldn't ask you to." "Good. Because I intend to pull my weight here. The girls and I aren't charity cases, and we're not decorations. We're people who can contribute to this place if you'll let us." The intensity in her voice caught Eli off guard. He'd been thinking of their arrangement in terms of rescue and shelter, not as a partnership. But watching Maura work that afternoon, seeing the satisfaction in her face as she completed each task, he began to understand that she needed purpose as much as she needed safety. "What else can you do?" he asked. "I can cook better than what we had last night, though I'll need to know. What supplies you keep on hand?" "I can clean and mend and organize. I know enough about livestock to help with the cattle when needed. And I have some knowledge of healing herbs and remedies that might be useful if any of the animals get sick." "Healing?" Maura nodded, a slight color rising in her cheeks. "My grandmother was what some people called a folk healer. She taught me about plants and their properties, how to treat common ailments in both people and animals. It's not exactly medical training, but it's proven useful over the years." Eli thought about his nearest neighbor, Tom Brennan, whose prize bull had been fighting a persistent infection that the veterinarian couldn't seem to cure. If Maura had knowledge that might help, there might be a market for that kind of skill. "Around here," he said carefully, "people are always looking for alternatives when conventional medicine falls short. I'd need to be careful. Some folks don't take kindly to what they call women's nonsense. Some folks are fools. Others are practical enough to accept help wherever it comes from." That evening, as they sat down to a supper that was indeed better than the previous night's simple fare, Eli found himself studying his unusual household. The twins chattered about their day's discoveries, their initial shyness melting away with each passing hour. Maura contributed to the conversation when asked direct questions, but mostly listened. Her attention focused on her daughters with the protective intensity of a mother hen. "Mr. Garner," Lily said during dessert canned peaches that had transformed into something special under Maura's attention, "do you get lonely living here by yourself?" The question caught him unprepared. He'd grown so accustomed to his solitude that he'd stopped thinking of it as loneliness, more like a natural state of being. But sitting at his table with these 3 people, hearing conversation and laughter echo through rooms that had been silent for so long, he realized how much he'd been missing. The recipe box sat on the kitchen counter, like a small shrine to a life that had ended too soon. Sarah's neat handwriting covered index cards yellowed with age, each one a memory of meals shared and love expressed through the simple act of feeding someone well. Eli had avoided opening it for 15 years, but watching Mara struggle to create satisfying meals from his sparse pantry had finally prompted him to retrieve it from its hiding place in the back of a cabinet. "These are beautiful," Maura said, handling the cards with the reverence they deserved. "Your wife's recipes?" Sarah's grandmother started the collection. Sarah added to it over the years we were married. Eli touched the corner of one card where Sarah's pencil had smudged. She always said recipes were meant to be shared, not hidden away. The twins had discovered the small drawings Sarah had made in the margins, tiny sketches of herbs and measuring spoons, little hearts next to dishes that were Eli's favorites. Rose traced one of the hearts with her finger, a gesture so gentle it made Eli's chest tight. She drew these? Sarah was artistic, always doodling something when her hands were idle. He pulled out a card covered with more elaborate illustrations. This was a recipe for Sunday pot roast. See the little cow she drew in the corner? Lily giggled at the Cartoon Cow, and even Mora smiled at Sarah's whimsical additions to what should have been a practical collection. She had a sense of humor. She did. Made everything lighter, somehow. That afternoon, Mora attempted Sarah's chicken and dumplings, following the recipe card with the careful attention of someone translating a foreign language. The twins helped by measuring ingredients and stirring when directed, their small hands, learning the rhythm of cooking under their mother's patient guidance. "Mama used to cook with us before Papa got sick," Rose explained to Eli as she carefully leveled a cup of flour. "She said cooking was like making magic, but with food instead of spells." "Your mama's a wise woman," Eli replied, earning a quick smile from Mara that warmed him more than it should have. The dumplings didn't turn out exactly like Sarah's. They were a bit dense, and the seasoning wasn't quite right, but the effort itself felt like a gift. Sitting down to a meal that someone had prepared with care, in his own kitchen, using recipes his wife had treasured, it was as close to coming home as Eli had felt in 15 years. "We'll get better at it," Mora said, apologizing unnecessarily. "For the dumplings. It takes time to learn someone else's recipes." "Sarah would have liked you," Eli said without thinking, and felt his face heat as he realized how presumptuous that sounded. "I mean, she would have appreciated seeing her." Recipes used again. But Mora didn't seem offended. Instead, she studied his face with that careful attention he was beginning to recognize as her way of reading people. "Tell me about her," so he did. Over the course of that week, as autumn settled more firmly over the ranch and the twins grew comfortable enough to venture farther from the house each day, Eli found himself sharing memories he'd kept locked away for years. He told them about Sarah's laugh, how it could fill a room and chase away any shadow. He described her garden, the way she'd coaxed vegetables to grow in soil that shouldn't have supported much more than weeds. She wanted children so badly. He said one evening as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset. The twins were in the barn, teaching Buck the old horse to accept sugar cubes from their small hands. Every loss broke her heart a little more, but she never stopped hoping. "Hope can be a dangerous thing," Mora said quietly. "It can keep you going when you should probably give up, but it can also make you vulnerable to disappointment." "Is that what happened with your husband? Too much hope?" Mora was quiet for so long that Eli thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of years spent learning hard lessons. "I hoped Dennis would change. Every time he came home promising things would be different, I believed him, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. But you didn't give up hope entirely, or you wouldn't have survived what happened at that auction." "No," she agreed. "But I learned to be more careful about where I placed it." The conversation was interrupted by squeals of delight from the barn, as Buck apparently decided the sugar cubes were worth tolerating small hands patting his neck. Watching her daughter's joy, Mora's expression softened in a way that made her look younger, less burdened by the weight of difficult choices. "They're different here," she said, happier. "Rose hasn't had nightmares since the first night, and Lily actually laughed yesterday when she slipped in the mud. Real laughter, not the careful kind children make when they're trying not to upset." Adults. Eli had noticed the change too. The twins moved through his house and around his property with increasing confidence, their initial fearfulness giving way to natural curiosity. They'd learned the chickens' individual personalities and had convinced the barn cats to accept them as allies rather than intruders. Most remarkably, they'd begun to treat him as a source of comfort rather than potential threat. "Children are remarkably resilient when they feel safe," he observed. "Yes, but safety isn't just about being protected from harm. It's about knowing you belong somewhere, that your presence is wanted rather than merely tolerated." The comment stung because it was accurate. Eli realized he'd been thinking of their arrangement in temporary terms, a kindness extended until something more permanent could be arranged. But the twins had begun to put down roots with the speed that only children possessed, and Mara's improvements to the property showed an investment in staying rather than merely surviving. "How long were you planning to stay?" he asked. Mora turned to look at him directly, her green eyes serious in the fading light. "How long are you willing to have us?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to address. A month ago, Eli's answer would have been simple long enough to find them proper placement elsewhere. But watching the twins transform his quiet ranch into something alive with laughter and purpose, seeing Mara's competent hands repairing what he'd allowed to deteriorate, he found his perspective shifting. "I don't know," he admitted. "I never expected to have a family." "We're not your family," Mara said gently. "We're 3 people you helped when we had nowhere else to go. There's a difference." But even as she spoke the words, Eli wondered if she believed them any more than he did. The past week had established routines that felt natural rather than imposed. Mora rising early to prepare breakfast while he handled the morning chores. The twins helping with simple tasks that taught them responsibility while keeping them close to adult supervision. All of them gathering around the kitchen table each evening to share the day's experiences. It felt like family. Even if none of them were quite ready to call it that. The first test of their uncertain arrangement came when Tom Brennan stopped by the following Saturday. Eli's neighbor had always been a direct man, and he didn't waste time with pleasantries. Before addressing what everyone in the county was talking about, "Heard you took on some additional responsibilities at the auction last week," Tom said, accepting the coffee Eli offered, but keeping his attention on the twins, who were playing with stick dolls near the porch steps. "Word travels fast. Always does when something unusual happens. People are curious about your new arrangements." Eli bristled at the implied criticism in Tom's tone. People need to mind their own business. Maybe so. But when a man suddenly acquires a woman and 2 children in what some might call irregular circumstances, it tends to generate conversation. Tom lowered his voice. "There are questions about the propriety of the situation. Eli, unmarried woman living in your house, no chaperone, children involved. Those children needed help," Eli said firmly. "Their mother needed protection. If people want to make something improper out of basic human decency, that says more about them than it does about me." Tom held up his hands in a peacekeeping gesture. "I'm not criticizing, just warning you that some folks are talking. Pastor Williams has been asking questions about whether the church should intervene somehow." The idea of church intervention made Eli's blood pressure rise. Intervene how? Make sure the children are being properly cared for. Ensure Mrs. Kelly understands her options. Maybe help arrange a more conventional living situation. From inside the house came the sound of Mara humming while she worked. A melody Eli recognized as one Sarah used to sing while baking bread. The twins had abandoned their dolls to chase one of the barn cats across the yard, their laughter carrying on the afternoon breeze. It was the picture of domestic contentment, not a situation requiring intervention. "The children are fine," Eli sighed. "Better than fine. And Mrs. Kelly is a grown woman capable of making her own decisions." "I believe you. But appearances matter, especially when children are involved. Have you considered making the arrangement more official?" Eli stared at his neighbor. "Official how?" "Marriage, Eli. A wedding would settle all the questions and give Mrs. Kelly legal protection as your wife. Give the children a proper family name." The suggestion hit Eli like cold water. Marriage? He still wore Sarah's ring, still felt married to her memory in ways that had nothing to do with law or custom. The idea of taking another wife felt like betrayal, even if the marriage would be purely practical. "That's not we haven't," Eli struggled to find words. "It's not that kind of arrangement. Might need to become that kind of arrangement if you want to keep them," Tom said bluntly. "Gossip has a way of turning into official concern when it involves children's welfare. Better to head that off before it becomes a real problem." After Tom left, Eli found himself watching Mara and the twins with new eyes, seeing them not just as people he'd helped, but as a family unit that might be vulnerable to outside interference. The thought of losing them, of having them taken away by well-meaning busybodies who couldn't understand that unconventional didn't necessarily mean harmful filled him with surprising dread. When had their temporary arrangement begun to feel permanent? When had these strangers become people he couldn't imagine living without? That night, after the twins were asleep, Eli found Mara mending one of his shirts by lamplight, her needle moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to make things last. She looked up when he cleared his throat, her expression questioning. "We need to talk," he said. Lily's sketch lay spread across the kitchen table, a child's vision of the ranch rendered in careful pencil strokes that captured not what was, but what could be. She'd drawn the house with a fresh coat of paint, the barn doors properly hung, and flower gardens where only weeds currently grew. In her drawing, children played in a yard where chickens roamed freely, and a man and woman stood together on the porch, watching over it all with contentment. "She's quite the artist," Maura said, adjusting the lamp to better illuminate her daughter's work. "Always has been. Even when we had so little, she'd find ways to draw charcoal from the fire, berries for ink when we had them." Eli studied the drawing more closely, noting details that showed Lily had been paying attention during their weeks together. She'd included Buck the horse in his favorite spot near the water trough, had drawn the chicken coop with its slightly crooked door that he kept meaning to fix, and had even captured the way the big oak tree's branches stretched toward the house, as if offering protection. "She sees potential where others might only see problems," he observed. "Children do that. They don't know enough about limitations to be properly discouraged." Maura set down her mending and traced one of the flower gardens with her finger, though in this case, some of what she's drawn actually makes sense. These areas along the house foundation would be perfect for herbs and vegetables. The soil's good there, and they'd get morning sun but afternoon shade. Sarah always wanted a proper garden. Never had time to establish one before Eli stopped, the familiar catch in his throat when memories came too quickly. "Before she died," Maura finished gently. "It's all right to say it, you know. Death isn't a word that breaks anything more than what's already broken." The observation was delivered with the matter-of-fact kindness of someone who'd wrestled with her own losses. Eli found himself studying Maura's face in the lamplight, noticing details he'd missed before: the small scar above her left eyebrow, the way her hands moved with unconscious grace, even when performing simple tasks, the way she listened with her whole attention when someone spoke. "Tom Brennan stopped by today," he said, deciding to address the conversation that had been weighing on his mind all afternoon. "I saw him leave. He seemed uncomfortable. He had some concerns about our arrangement. Apparently, people in town are talking." Maura's hands stilled on her mending, though her expression remained calm. "What kind of talking?" "The kind that questions whether an unmarried woman should be living in a man's house, especially with children involved. Tom seems to think the church might decide to intervene." "Ah." Maura set down her needle and folded her hands in her lap. "And what do you think?" The question caught Eli off guard. He'd expected alarm, perhaps suggestions for alternative arrangements, not this calm request for his opinion. "I think people should mind their own business. But I also understand that your reputation matters, and the twins' welfare has to come first." "My reputation has been a topic of conversation before, Mr. Garner. When you marry a gambling man who disappears for weeks at a time, leaving you to explain his absences and make excuses for his behavior, you learn that gossip says more about the speakers than the subject." There was steel beneath her quiet words, a strength forged by years of defending herself against whispered criticism. Eli found himself admiring her composure, even as he worried about the practical implications of community disapproval. "This is different," he said. "If the church decides the children need to be placed elsewhere, then we'll deal with that if it happens." Maura picked up her mending again, her movements deliberate and calm. "But I won't live my life afraid of what people might say or do. I've spent too many years walking on eggshells, trying to avoid giving offense, watching my words and actions to prevent someone else's disapproval. I'm done with that." The firmness in her voice reminded Eli of Sarah, who'd possessed a similar quiet strength when facing challenges. But where Sarah's confidence had been born of a secure upbringing and community support, Maura's seemed forged in harder circumstances, tempered by necessity rather than nurtured by encouragement. Tom suggested one solution that would settle all questions, Eli said carefully, which is marriage. A legal ceremony that would make you my wife and give the twins my name. It would provide protection and respectability, stop all gossip immediately. Maura's needle paused in mid-stitch, but she didn't look up from her work. A marriage of convenience. Yes, purely practical. Nothing would have to change between us personally, but legally you'd be protected, and the twins would have a father's name. And what would you gain from such an arrangement? The question made Eli consider motivations he hadn't fully examined. What would he gain? Respectability was important, but not his primary concern. The truth was more complicated and harder to articulate. Peace of mind, he said finally, knowing that you and the girls couldn't be taken away by bureaucrats or well-meaning neighbors. Knowing that this place had purpose again, that Sarah's recipes and gardens and dreams weren't just gathering dust. Mora set down her mending and looked at him directly. Mr. Garner Eli, I need you to understand something. I married for love once, young and foolish, and certain that passion was enough to overcome any obstacle. It wasn't. Love without respect, without partnership, without shared values is just emotional quicksand that pulls everyone down eventually. I'm not offering love, Eli said quietly. I'm offering security, stability, a home where you and the twins can put down roots without fear. And what happens if you do fall in love again? What happens when you meet someone who makes your heart race the way Sarah did? Where does that leave a wife of convenience and her children? The question revealed fears Eli hadn't considered. He'd been thinking of marriage as a legal arrangement, a solution to practical problems. But Mara was right to consider emotional complications that might arise over time. I don't expect to fall in love again, he said. That part of my life ended with Sarah. You're 57, not 97. And love has a way of arriving when you least expect it, in forms you never imagined. Mora's voice carried the weight of experience. I've seen what happens when people enter marriages without genuine affection or commitment. Someone always gets hurt. Before Eli could respond, small footsteps on the stairs announced that one of the twins was awake. Rose appeared in the kitchen doorway, rubbing her eyes and looking younger than her 8 years in a nightgown that had seen better days. Mama, I heard voices. Is everything all right? Everything's fine, sweetheart. Did you have another bad dream? Rose shook her head and padded over to the table, drawn by Lily's drawing. She finished it. Look, Mama, she drew us all together like a real family. The innocent observation hung in the air, like a question neither adult was ready to answer. In Lily's drawing, the family on the porch looked content, settled, permanent. But real life was more complicated than a child's artistic vision, full of considerations that couldn't be solved with pencil and paper. It's a beautiful picture, Eli said, meaning it. Your sister has real talent. She wants to be an artist when she grows up. I want to be a rancher like you. Rose climbed onto Mora's lap with the casual confidence of a child who'd never doubted her welcome. Will you teach me about cattle and horses and growing things? I'd be honored to teach you whatever you want to learn, Eli said, surprised by how much he meant it. Good, and maybe someday I can draw pictures like Lily, but with real things instead of pretend ones. Mora smoothed her daughter's hair, her expression thoughtful. Real things are more complicated than pictures, sweetheart. Sometimes what looks perfect on paper doesn't work the same way in life. But sometimes it does, Rose said with 8-year-old certainty. Sometimes things work out exactly like you draw them, if you want them enough and try hard enough. After Rose was settled back in bed, Eli and Mora returned to their conversation, but the child's innocent faith had shifted something in the atmosphere. The practical discussion of marriage arrangements now carried additional weight, the hopes and dreams of 2 little girls who'd begun to see the ranch as home. They're settling in, Mora said unnecessarily. More than settling, they're thriving. Rose asked me yesterday if she could help with the spring planting. Lily wants to learn how to milk cows, though we'll need to get a cow first. They're building. Expectations, Mora said softly. Assuming this is permanent when it might not be, does it have to be temporary? The question surprised them both. Eli hadn't planned to ask it so directly, but seeing Lily's drawing, hearing Rose's casual references to future plans, watching Mora's improvements transform his property day by day, it all pointed toward permanence rather than temporary shelter. Don't know, Mora admitted. 6 weeks ago, I thought my life was over. Now I'm sitting in a warm kitchen, mending clothes for a man who saved us from something unspeakable, watching my daughters discover what it feels like to be safe. It doesn't feel real yet. It's real. The question is whether we can make it work long term without complicating things beyond repair. Maura was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the pattern on Lily's drawing. If we were to consider marriage a practical arrangement, as you suggested, what would your expectations be? The question was asked with the careful precision of someone negotiating a business contract, but Eli heard the vulnerability beneath her practical tone. She was asking about intimacy without using the word, wondering about expectations she might not be ready to meet. I'd expect honesty, respect, partnership in running this place, care for each other's welfare without conditions or demands. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Anything beyond that would have to develop naturally, if it developed at all. No expectations, no requirements. And if it never developed beyond partnership, then we'd have a good partnership. That's more than many marriages have. Maura studied his face in the lamplight, reading sincerity in his expression. You really mean that? I do. I've been alone for 15 years, Maura. I know the difference. Between loneliness and solitude, between wanting someone and needing someone. What I need is what you and the girls have already given me: purpose, companionship, a reason to care about this place again. Everything else is just possibility, not requirement. The honesty of his answer seemed to reassure her. For the first time since Tom's visit, her shoulders relaxed completely. I'll need time to think about it. And I'll need to talk to the girls, though I suspect they'd be thrilled at the prospect of staying permanently. Take all the time you need. But Maura, whatever you decide, you're safe here. Marriage or no marriage, you and the twins have a home as long as you want one. As they said goodnight and went to their separate rooms, Eli found himself thinking about Lily's drawing, about the family on the porch who looked so content with their life together. Maybe Rose was right. Maybe sometimes things did work out exactly like you drew them, if you wanted them enough and were brave enough to try. Rose's carved animals filled the front window of Henderson's general store like a miniature Noah's Ark. Each piece no bigger than a child's paw, but detailed enough to capture the personality of its living inspiration. The wooden horses pranced with carved manes flowing, the chickens pecked at invisible grain with beaks opened just so, and a particularly charming cow bore an unmistakable resemblance to Bessie, Tom Brennan's prize Holstein. People can't stop talking about them, Martha Henderson told Eli as he examined his neighbor's daughter's handiwork. Children, especially. Little Mary Preston has been saving her pennies for 2 weeks to buy the spotted pig. Says it looks just like the one her grandfather used to have. Eli picked up one of the horses, marveling at the smooth finish and careful attention to proportion. Rose had discovered an old set of whittling tools in the barn's tack room, probably left behind by his father or grandfather, and had taken to the craft with natural aptitude that surprised everyone. How much is she asking for them? 25 cents each, 50 cents for the larger pieces. Seems fair for the work involved, and it's teaching her the value of honest labor. Martha's expression grew thoughtful. That girl has real talent. Eli, with proper instruction, she could make a decent living with her carving. The idea of Rose supporting herself through artistic work would have seemed impossible just 2 months ago, when she'd been standing barefoot in an auction ring facing an uncertain future. Now she was discovering abilities none of them had known she possessed, turning simple blocks of wood into treasures that brought joy to other children. I'll take them all, Eli said impulsively. Whatever she's made, I'll buy the lot. Now, Eli, that's kind but unnecessary. They're selling well on their own merit. People appreciate good craftsmanship, especially when it comes from such a young artist. But Eli was already counting out bills, his mind on the expression that would light Rose's face when she learned her work was valued by the community. She needs to know that her efforts matter, that people see worth in what she creates. Truth was more complicated than simple encouragement. Over the past weeks, Eli had watched both twins blossom under the influence of stability and acceptance. But he'd also seen the way they still flinched at sudden movements, still asked permission, for things that should have been automatic for children their age. They were healing, But healing took time, and confidence had to be rebuilt piece by careful piece. Spring had arrived early that year, bringing with it a surge of activity that transformed the ranch from winter's quiet dormancy into bustling purposefulness. Mora's garden begun as an experimental patch near the kitchen. Window had expanded into ambitious plots that promised fresh vegetables through the growing season. The twins had claimed responsibility for the chickens, turning what had been a simple matter of collecting eggs into an elaborate social interaction with each bird's individual personality. But it was the subtle changes in daily routine that most clearly marked their transformation from refugees to family. Morning chores were shared without discussion, each person taking on tasks that suited their abilities and interests. Meals had become events worth anticipating, featuring recipes that combined Sarah's traditional favorites with dishes from Mora's own family background. Evenings were spent together more often than apart, reading aloud or working on individual projects while enjoying each other's company. Most remarkably, the house itself had begun to feel alive again. Rooms that had been closed off for years now served their intended purposes. The front parlor, where Sarah had entertained visitors, was once again a gathering place. The sewing room had become a combination art studio and workshop where both twins pursued their creative interests. And the master bedroom no longer felt like a shrine to the past, but like a space waiting for new memories. Eli had moved his belongings to one of the smaller bedrooms without fanfare, a practical decision that acknowledged the changing dynamics of the household. Mora had never asked him to relocate, but the gesture seemed to ease some invisible tension, creating physical space that allowed emotional boundaries to develop naturally. "You know, the whole county's talking about your unusual family situation," Tom Brennan had mentioned during his most recent visit, but his tone carried approval rather than criticism. "Pastor Williams says he's never seen children settle so quickly after trauma. Whatever you're doing, it's working." What they were doing, Eli reflected, was simply allowing themselves to become what they were naturally evolving toward, a unit that functioned well together, supporting each other's strengths and compensating for individual weaknesses. It wasn't the traditional nuclear family that society expected, but it was functional in ways that mattered more than conventional appearances. The question of marriage still hung between him and Mora like smoke from a distant fire present, but not immediately threatening, requiring attention, but not demanding immediate action. They'd discussed it twice more since Tom's initial suggestion, conversations that grew easier each time as they learned to navigate the practical considerations without emotional undertones. "I've been thinking about your proposal," Mora had said 3 days earlier as they worked together in the garden, her hands gentle with seedlings that would eventually feed them all. Not the marriage proposal specifically, but the underlying question of permanence. Eli had looked up from the row of bean plants he was staking, noting how the afternoon sun brought out red highlights in her dark hair. "And what have you concluded?" "That the twins and I have already made our choice, whether we formalized it or not. This is home now. The question is whether making it official would help or complicate what we've built." The observation had been accurate and honest, acknowledging what they all felt but hadn't quite voiced. Somewhere in the daily routine of shared meals and collaborative work, of small kindnesses and mutual support, they'd stopped being strangers sharing space and become something more integrated and permanent. "There are practical advantages to marriage," Eli had replied, voicing considerations they'd both been weighing. "Legal protection for you and the girls, social respectability that would end gossip, inheritance rights that would ensure the ranch passes to people who actually care about it. And disadvantages? Expectations? Assumptions from outsiders about the nature of our relationship. Potential complications if either of us develops feelings that aren't reciprocated." Mora had been quiet for several minutes, her attention apparently focused on the careful spacing of lettuce seeds. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of careful consideration. "I think we're already past most of those complications. We live together, work together, share responsibility for the children and the property. If feelings were going to develop, they probably already would have." The comment had stung slightly, though Eli couldn't quite identify why. It was true that their relationship had settled into comfortable partnership rather than romantic tension, But hearing it stated so matter-of-factly felt like having a door closed on possibilities he hadn't realized he was considering. So you're saying marriage would just formalize what already exists? I'm saying it might provide security without significantly changing our daily lives. The twins would have your name and the protection that comes with it. I'd have legal status as your wife, which would end questions about propriety. And you'd have the family you never expected to gain. Now, standing in Henderson's general store with Rose's carved animals in his hands, Eli found himself thinking about the future those small wooden figures represented. Children who created beauty from simple materials, who found joy in sharing their talents with others, who were building the kind of memories that would sustain them through whatever challenges life might bring. He wanted to be part of that future. Not just as a benevolent guardian, but as someone who belonged in the picture Lily had drawn of their family gathered on the porch. The realization came with surprising clarity. What had begun as rescue had evolved into something much more personal and profound. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table admiring Rose's earnings from her first commercial art sale, Eli made a decision that felt as natural as breathing. "Maura, I'd like to ask you something formally." She looked up from counting the coins Rose had earned, her expression curious but not alarmed. The twins continued examining the money, marveling at the idea that Rose's hobby could generate actual income. "Would you marry me? Not for convention or protection, or any reason, except that I want us to be a real family. I want the twins to be my daughters legally, and in every other way that matters. I want you to be my wife, not because it's practical, but because I can't imagine this life without you in it." The words surprised him with their honesty. When had partnership evolved into affection? When had convenience become genuine care? He couldn't pinpoint the moment, but he could see its truth reflected in Maura's startled expression, in the way her hand moved instinctively to cover his. "Eli, Mama, what's marriage?" Lily interrupted, her attention finally caught by the adult conversation. "It's when two people decide to be a family officially," Rose answered with 8-year-old authority. "Like how you and Papa were married, but Papa's gone now, so you could marry someone else if you wanted to." "Would that make Mr. Eli our Papa?" Lily asked, the question so hopeful it made Eli's chest tight. "It would make him your stepfather legally," Maura said carefully. "But what matters more is that he'd be someone who loves you and takes care of you and helps you grow up to be the people you're meant to become." "I already love them," Eli said quietly. "All of you." "It took me by surprise, but there it is." Rose looked between the adults with the shrewd assessment of a child who'd learned to read emotional undercurrents for survival. "Does this mean we get to stay forever?" "Really forever, not just until something bad happens." "Really forever," Eli confirmed, meeting Maura's eyes across the table. "If your mother says yes." Maura studied his face with the careful attention she'd given his proposal 2 months earlier, but this time she was reading different questions in his expression. Not just practical concern for their welfare, but genuine affection for who they were as individuals and as a family unit. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." The twins erupted in cheers that brought the barn cats running to investigate, and for the first time in 15 years, Eli's house rang with the sound of unconditional joy. Later, after the excitement had settled and the girls were in bed, he found Maura on the front porch where Lily had drawn them standing together in her picture. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew his answer. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he replied, meaning every word dot above them. Stars emerged in the vast Montana sky bearing witness to promises made and futures chosen with open hearts. The legal documents arrived on a Tuesday morning in early June, delivered by a nervous-looking clerk from the territorial courthouse, who seemed relieved to hand over the official envelope and retreat quickly from the ranch. Eli signed for the papers with growing unease, noting the return address from the federal marshal's office in Helena. Inside the house, Maura was teaching the twins to braid their hair for the wedding ceremony, planned for the following weekend. Their laughter drifted through the open windows, mixing with the sound of chickens clucking in the yard and the distant lowing of cattle. peaceful domestic sounds that made the official documents feel even more ominous. Eli opened the envelope, carefully scanning the dense legal language that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify meaning. But certain phrases jumped out with alarming clarity: fraudulent documentation, illegal human trafficking, federal investigation, and most chilling of all, Jake Morrison, a.k.a. Jacob Morgenstern, wanted for questioning. His hands trembled as he read the full report. According to federal investigators, Dennis Kelly's gambling debts had been fabricated, part of an elaborate scheme Morrison used to acquire women and children for illegal purposes. The auction where Eli had first seen Maura, and the twins hadn't, been a legitimate debt settlement. It had been human trafficking disguised as legal proceedings. The documentation that Morrison had presented as proof of Dennis Kelly's debts was entirely falsified. Worse, the investigation revealed that Morrison had used similar schemes across 3 territories, targeting recent widows with children, creating fictional gambling debts, then collecting families through fake legal auctions. The individual known as Jake Morrison has been operating under multiple aliases. The report continued, including Jacob Morgenstern, James Morse, and John Masters. His organization has been trafficking women and children across territorial lines for the purposes of forced labor and other illegal activities. Mrs. Kelly and her children were intended for transport to mining camps in Colorado, where previous victims had been held in conditions amounting to slavery. Eli's blood ran cold as he absorbed the full implications. If he hadn't bid at that auction, if he hadn't been moved by unexpected compassion to intervene, Maura and the twins would have disappeared into a nightmare from which they might never have escaped. But the documents contained more disturbing news. Morrison was still at large, and federal marshals believed he would return to reclaim what he considered his property. The report included a formal warning that the Garner Ranch was under surveillance as a potential target, and that local law enforcement had been notified to provide protection. Mr. Garner, the final page read, "You and Mrs. Kelly are requested to appear at the federal courthouse in Helena at your earliest convenience to provide testimony that will assist in the prosecution of this criminal organization. Your intervention at the auction has provided crucial evidence, but we fear Morrison will attempt to reclaim his merchandise before our investigation is complete." The sound of footsteps on the porch announced Maura's approach. Eli quickly folded the documents, but not quickly enough to escape her notice. "What's wrong?" she asked, her expression shifting immediately from contentment to concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost. We need to talk, privately." Maura called to the twins, asking them to gather eggs from the chicken coop, and followed Eli into the front parlor where they could speak without being overheard. He handed her the documents without preamble, watching her face change as she read. "Oh God," she whispered, sinking into Sarah's old rocking chair. It was all fake. Dennis never owed Morrison anything. The investigators think Morrison targeted you specifically because you are vulnerable recent widow, young children, no family support. He probably manufactured the gambling debt story and waited for the right moment to collect. Maura's hands shook as she continued reading. Mining camps in Colorado, forced labor. What would have happened to Lily and Rose? Eli couldn't bring himself to voice the possibilities the report implied. Children in illegal mining operations faced horrors that no parent should ever contemplate. The fact that his impulsive bid had prevented such a fate felt like divine intervention rather than mere coincidence. "The important thing is that it didn't happen," he said, though his own voice lacked conviction. "You're safe now, all of you." "Are we?" Maura looked up from the papers, fear replacing the peace that had settled over her features in recent weeks. "The report says Morrison is still out there, that he might come back. Federal marshals are watching. Local law enforcement has been notified, and Morrison would be insane to show his face here now that his operation has been exposed." But even as Eli spoke the reassuring words, he remembered Morrison's cold confidence at the auction, the man's obvious belief that he operated above the law. Would official investigation be enough to deter someone who'd built a criminal enterprise on the assumption that isolated territorial settlements offered little resistance to organized crime? "There's something else," Maura said quietly, pointing to a section of the report Eli had skimmed over. Other families. The investigation mentions other women and children who were taken by Morrison's organization. Some of them are still missing. Eli. Read the referenced passage more carefully, his stomach turning as he absorbed the scope of Morrison's operation. At least 12 families across 3 territories had fallen victim to similar schemes over the past 2 years. Most of the women and children had disappeared entirely, presumably transported to remote locations where they could be exploited without interference. "We have to testify," Mora said, her voice growing stronger with resolve. "If our testimony can help find those other families, help stop Morrison from hurting anyone else, then we have to do it. Testifying means making ourselves visible to Morrison and his associates. It means painting a target on our backs. The target's already there. At least this way, we can fight back." Before Eli could respond, excited voices from the yard announced. The twins returned from their egg-gathering mission. Through the window, he could see them racing each other to the porch, their arms full of fresh eggs and their faces bright with the uncomplicated joy of children who believe themselves safe. "We can't tell them," Mora said, following his gaze. "Not yet. They've just started feeling secure here. I won't take that away from them unless absolutely necessary." Eli understood her maternal protectiveness, but he also recognized the practical problems their situation created. How could they prepare for potential danger without alarming the children? How could they maintain the illusion of safety while taking reasonable precautions against a very real threat? "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to get married. As planned this weekend. I want to give the girls the security of knowing they belong here legally, whatever happens next. And then I want to go to Helena and help the federal marshals put Morrison in prison where he belongs." The determination in her voice reminded Eli of Sarah's quiet courage when facing medical uncertainties during her pregnancies. Both women possessed the rare ability to confront danger without being paralyzed by fear, to make decisions based on principle rather than personal safety. "All right, we'll proceed with the wedding, but I'm going to make some additional preparations. Talk to Tom Brennan about keeping an eye on the property. Make sure we have ways to communicate with law enforcement if needed. Perhaps arrange for the twins to stay with neighbors when we travel to Helena. You do that? Risk your own safety to help strangers you'll never meet?" The question surprised Eli with its naivety. Over the past months, Mora and the twins had become the center of his world, the reason he rose each morning with purpose instead of mere habit. The idea that he wouldn't risk everything to protect them seemed absurd. "Mora, you're not strangers. Anymore, you're my family. Whatever threatens you threatens all of us." She stood from the rocking chair and moved to the window where the twins were now chasing chickens around the yard, their earlier task forgotten in favor of play. "They deserve to grow up free," she said quietly. "Free from fear, free from the kind of men who would treat children like property to be bought and sold. They will. We'll make sure of it." That evening, after the twins were asleep, Eli and Mara sat on the front porch discussing practical preparations for what might come. They spoke in low voices about escape routes and emergency signals, about weapons Eli kept locked in his gun, cabinet and neighbors who could be trusted with the twins' safety. "I never thought I'd have to plan for violence again," Eli admitted, remembering his own father's stories about frontier dangers that seemed relegated to history. This was supposed to be civilized country now. Evil adapts to new circumstances. Mora replied. Morrison found ways to use the law itself as a weapon against vulnerable people, but good people adapt too. We'll find ways to fight back. Above them, stars emerged in the clear June sky, the same stars that had witnessed their engagement just weeks earlier. But tonight their light seemed different, less romantic, more like the cold illumination of centuries standing watch over an uncertain world. "Do you regret agreeing to marry me?" Eli asked. "Now that you know what we might be facing?" Mora was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains that formed a protective barrier around their valley. When she finally spoke, her voice carried absolute certainty. "I regret that evil men like Morrison exist. I regret that children like Lily and Rose have to grow up in a world where such predators operate. But I don't regret choosing to stand with you against them. Some fights are worth having, Eli. This is one of them. In the distance, a coyote howled its lonesome song to the night sky, a sound that might have seemed ominous under different circumstances. But sitting beside Mora on the porch of their shared home, planning their defense of the family they'd built together, Eli found the wild cry oddly comforting. They were no longer alone in facing whatever came next. And that, perhaps, made all the difference. Eli's father's Winchester rifle lay across his knees like a sleeping serpent, its walnut stock worn smooth by 3 generations of Garner hands. He'd retrieved it from the gun cabinet that morning, along with a box of cartridges that had been gathering dust since his last hunting trip 5 years earlier. The weight of the weapon felt foreign after so many years of peace, but its presence provided comfort he hadn't expected to need again. From his position on the front porch, he could see most of the approaches to the ranch house, the main road that wound through the valley, the cattle trail that connected to Tom Brainen's property, and the narrow creek bed that offered concealment for anyone approaching on foot. Federal Marshal William Hayes had positioned his men strategically around the property, but Eli knew the land better than any outsider could, knew every hiding place and vantage point that might offer advantage to friend or foe. The wedding had taken place 3 days earlier, a simple ceremony in the front parlor with Pastor Williams officiating and Tom Brennan serving as witness. Mora had worn Sarah's wedding dress, altered carefully to fit her smaller frame, and the twins had served as flower girls with a solemnity that spoke to their understanding of the occasion's importance. They were officially a family now, bound by law as well as affection, and Eli wore his new responsibilities with pride that surprised him with its intensity. But the celebration had been brief. Marshal Hayes had arrived the morning after the ceremony with news that Morrison's organization was on the move. Informants in Colorado reported that several of Morrison's associates had disappeared from their usual haunts, suggesting that the criminal network was either consolidating its operations or preparing for some kind of final action before scattering. To avoid prosecution, our sources indicate that Morrison considers your wife and stepdaughters to be stolen property, Hayes had explained, his weathered face grim with professional concern. He's invested considerable resources in acquiring them, and men like Morrison don't write off investments easily. We believe he'll make an attempt to reclaim them, either for his original purposes or simply to send a message to others who might interfere with his operations. The federal marshals had offered to relocate the family to a safe house in Helena until Morrison was captured, but Mora had refused with a firmness that brooked no argument. "Running away won't solve anything," she'd said, "and I won't spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering when he might appear. Better to face this here, on ground we know, with people we trust." Eli had supported her decision, though privately he wondered if courage was the same thing as wisdom. The ranch offered defensive advantages, clear sight lines, familiar terrain, and neighbors within shouting distance, but it also meant making themselves targets for whatever Morrison might attempt. The twins had been told only that some bad men might try to cause trouble, and that they needed to stay close to the house and follow adult instructions without question. Their acceptance of these restrictions with minimal protest demonstrated a maturity beyond their years, born of experiences no children should have to endure. "Lily keeps asking why the men with badges are camping at our barn," Rose had confided to Eli that morning as they fed the chickens together. "I told her they're protecting us, but she wants to know from what." "What did you tell her?" "That some people in the world aren't very nice, and sometimes good people have to work together to stop them from hurting others." Rose scattered corn with careful precision, her young face serious with concentration. "Is that right?" "That's exactly right, sweetheart, and you're being very brave about all of this. Mama says being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what's right even when you are scared." A wisdom in her words reminded Eli that courage often came from unexpected sources. This 8-year-old girl, who'd survived trauma that would break many adults, was teaching him about facing fear with grace and determination. Now, as afternoon shadows lengthened across the ranch yard, Eli found himself thinking about the kind of world he wanted Rose and Lily to inherit. A world where children could play without guards watching from the shadows, where families weren't hunted by predators, who saw human beings as commodities to be traded. Marshal Hayes emerged from the alley, barn where he'd established his command post, his expression alert but not alarmed. "Riders approaching from the east," he called quietly. 3 men, moving slow and careful-like. Eli's grip tightened on the Winchester as he scanned the eastern horizon. Their dust rising from the main road, still a mile distant, but clearly heading toward the ranch. Too far yet to identify the riders, but their cautious approach suggested they weren't casual visitors. "Could be neighbors," Eli said, though his instincts suggested otherwise. Tom Brennan and the other local ranchers rode with the confident directness of men traveling familiar ground. These riders moved with the calculating caution of predators evaluating potential prey. Maybe, but neighbors usually announce themselves long before they get this close. Hayes signaled to his deputies, who melted into concealed positions around the property with practiced efficiency. "Why don't you get your family inside, Mr. Garner? Just as a precaution." Eli found Mora in the kitchen, helping the twins with arithmetic lessons that seemed absurdly normal given the circumstances. Lily was struggling with long division, while Rose worked ahead on multiplication tables. Both girls bent over their slates with the concentration of students who'd learned that education was a privilege not to be wasted. "We need to move to the back bedroom," Eli said quietly, not wanting to alarm the children unnecessarily. "Marshal Hayes wants everyone away from the front windows for a while." Mora's eyes met his across the kitchen table, reading the tension in his expression. Without comment, she gathered the slates and pencils while Eli helped the twins down from their chairs. "Are the bad men coming?" Lily whispered, her hand slipping into Eli's with a trust that still amazed him. "We don't know yet, sweetheart, but we're going to stay safe and quiet until the marshals tell us everything's all right." The back bedroom offered protection from the front of the house while maintaining a view of the rear approach routes. Eli positioned himself at the window where he could observe both the approaching riders and the marshals' defensive positions. The Winchester felt heavier in his hands now that actual danger might be imminent. "There," Mora said softly, pointing toward the main road. "I can see them now." 3 riders had crested the small hill that marked the eastern boundary of Eli's property. Even at distance, their expensive clothing and well-maintained horses marked them as outsiders, men with resources who weren't accustomed to honest labor. The lead rider sat his horse with the arrogant confidence Eli remembered from the auction. Jake Morrison, come to collect what he considered his property. "It's him," Mora breathed, her face pale but her voice steady. "Morrison, and 2 others I don't recognize." The twins pressed against the window beside their mother, their young faces serious as they observed the approaching threat. Rose pointed toward the barn where Marshal Hayes had positioned his men. "The marshals are hiding, but I can see their rifles." "Are they going to arrest the bad men?" "If the bad men try to hurt anyone, yes," Eli replied. "Our job is to stay here and let the marshals do their work." But he knew the situation was more complicated than simple arrest. Morrison had operated his criminal enterprise by exploiting legal loopholes and territorial jurisdictional confusion. He might claim legitimate business, might present forged documents that would require time and investigation to disprove. Meanwhile, the immediate threat to his family would remain unresolved. The riders had reached the main gate now, close enough for Eli to see Morrison's cold smile as he surveyed the ranch with proprietary interest. The man seemed utterly confident, as if he expected no resistance to whatever he planned. Marshal Hayes stepped out from behind the barn, his badge visible and his rifle held in ready position. His voice carried clearly across the ranch yard, formal and commanding. "Jake Morrison, you're under federal investigation for human trafficking and fraud. I need you and your associates to dismount and submit to questioning." Morrison's laugh was audible even from the house, a sound devoid of humor or concern. "Marshal, I'm afraid you're confused about my business here. I've come to collect property that was illegally obtained at a fraudulent auction. Mrs. Kelly and her children belong to me under legal contract, and I intend to reclaim them." "Those contracts were forged, Morrison. We have evidence of your criminal activities across 3 territories. Evidence that will take months to verify through proper legal channels. Meanwhile, I have immediate rights that supersede your investigation. Morrison reached into his jacket, producing papers that he waved with theatrical confidence. Federal territorial law is quite clear about property rights, Marshal. I'm within my rights to reclaim stolen goods. From their position at the bedroom window, Eli could see the tactical problem developing. Morrison had positioned himself legally, claiming legitimate business, while forcing the marshals to either act without full legal authority or allow him to approach the house. It was a calculated gamble that exploited the complexities of territorial law enforcement. He's not going to give up, Morris said quietly. Even if the marshals arrest him today, there will be appeals, legal challenges, other associates who might continue his work. This won't end until Morrison himself is permanently stopped. Eli understood what she was suggesting without her having to state it explicitly. Legal justice moved slowly, especially in territorial courts where jurisdictional authority remained unclear. But there were other forms of justice, older and more immediate, that didn't depend on judges or juries. The twins, he said, will be safe. No matter what happens, they'll be safe. Below in the ranch yard, the confrontation continued as Morrison's associates dismounted and began moving toward the house with the confidence of men who believed law was on their side. Marshal Hayes and his deputies were outnumbered and outmaneuvered, forced to choose between immediate action that might lack legal backing or allowing criminals to approach the family they'd been sent to protect. Eli made his decision with the clarity that came from absolute certainty about what mattered most. His family, his wife and daughters, would not be taken. Not today, not ever. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, he would not allow Morrison to succeed. Stay here, he told Mora and the twins. No matter what happens, stay in this room until either I come back or Marshal Hayes tells you it's safe. He kissed each of the girls on the forehead, receiving their trust like a benediction, then kissed Mora with the tenderness of a man who understood that some moments might be final. Eli, I love you. All of you. That's all that matters now. The Winchester felt lighter as he left the bedroom, its weight balanced by the certainty of purpose. He'd spent 15 years believing his life was effectively over, that he had nothing left to lose and nothing worth fighting for. Now he knew different. Some things were worth any price to protect. Lily's slingshot lay forgotten on the kitchen table, its leather pouch still holding the smooth stone she'd been practicing with that morning. The simple weapon represented her growing confidence and independence qualities that had blossomed under the safety and encouragement of ranch life. Now it seemed a fragile defense against the evil that had arrived at their doorstep. Eli moved through his house with the quiet purpose of a man preparing for war. He checked the loading of his Winchester, ensured he had spare cartridges within easy reach, and positioned himself at the front window where he could support Marshal Hayes, while maintaining a clear field of fire. The weight of responsibility settled over him like familiar clothing protecting. What mattered most had always been simple to understand, even when it wasn't simple to accomplish. Through the glass, he could see Morrison and his associates advancing toward the house with the measured confidence of predators who believed themselves in control of the situation. The federal marshals had taken defensive positions, but seemed constrained by legal considerations that Morrison was obviously exploiting. Federal authority in territorial disputes remained murky, and Morrison's forged documents might provide enough legal cover to prevent immediate arrest. "Mr. Garner," Morrison called out as he approached the front porch, his voice carrying the false courtesy of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. "I believe you have something that belongs to me. I'd appreciate the opportunity to discuss this matter like civilized men." Eli opened the front door, but remained inside, the Winchester visible but not yet raised to shooting position. "You're not welcome here, Morrison. The federal marshals have told you to leave. The marshals are operating under incomplete information. My legal claim to Mrs. Kelly and her children predates any arrangements you may have made. Territory law recognizes property rights that supersede subsequent transactions." The casual reference to human beings as property made Eli's blood burn, but he kept his voice level and controlled. "There are no property rights involved here. Mrs. Kelly is my wife, and those children are my daughters. Any claims you think. You have died with Dennis Kelly. Morrison's smile never wavered, but something cold and dangerous flickered in his eyes. "Mr. Garner, I've invested considerable resources in acquiring specific merchandise. I don't write off investments lightly, and I don't allow theft to go unpunished. One way or another, I'm leaving here with what belongs to me. Over my dead body. That can be arranged." The threat was delivered with casual confidence that revealed Morrison's true nature, a man who'd built his criminal empire on violence and intimidation, who saw other human beings as commodities to be traded or obstacles to be removed. Legal niceties were just tools he used when convenient, not principles that constrained his actions. Marshal Hayes had moved closer during the conversation, his rifle trained on Morrison's associates, who were spreading out to flank the house. "Morrison, you're under arrest for human trafficking, fraud, and conspiracy. Order your men to surrender their weapons and submit to federal custody." "Marshal, I'm conducting legitimate business under territorial law. Any interference with my property rights constitutes federal overreach that will be challenged in court." Morrison's voice carried the practiced authority of someone who'd successfully manipulated legal systems before. "I suggest you stand down before you create an incident that embarrasses your superiors." The standoff stretched taut as piano wire, each side waiting for the other to make the first aggressive move. Eli could see Morrison's associates positioning themselves for an assault on the house, could read the tactical calculation in their movements. They weren't planning to negotiate. They were preparing to take what they wanted by force. From somewhere behind him came a small sound footsteps on the stairs, too light to be Morris. Eli's heart clenched as he realized one of the twins had disobeyed instructions to stay in the back bedroom. He couldn't turn to look without taking his attention off Morrison, but he could hear the soft breathing of a child who'd crept down to see what was happening. "Papa, Eli?" Lily's whisper was barely audible, but it carried clearly in the tense silence. "Are the bad men going to take us away?" The word "Papa" hit Eli like a physical blow, reminding him of everything he stood to lose if Morrison succeeded. These weren't just people he was protecting. They were his family, children who'd learned to trust him with their safety and their hearts. "No, sweetheart," he said without turning around. "Nobody's taking you anywhere. Go back upstairs to your mother." But Morrison had heard the exchange, and his predatory smile widened as he realized the emotional leverage now available to him. The merchandise has become attached to its temporary caretaker. How touching. But children adapt quickly, too. New circumstances, Mr. Garner. They'll forget you soon enough once they're properly placed. A casual cruelty of the comment shattered Eli's remaining restraint. These weren't business negotiations or legal disputes. This was evil in its purest form, threatening everything good and innocent in his world. His finger moved to the Winchester's trigger as righteous fury overcame prudent caution. "Eli, don't!" Marshal Hayes shouted, recognizing the change in Eli's posture. "Let us handle this legally." But Morrison had already seen the decision in Eli's face, had read the transition from defensive positioning to lethal intent. His hand moved toward the pistol beneath his jacket as his civilized mask finally slipped to reveal the killer underneath. "Take them," Morrison barked to his associates. "Now." The ranch yard exploded into violence as Morrison's men rushed the house while their leader drew his weapon. Marshal Hayes and his deputies opened fire from their concealed positions, but Morrison's tactical planning had anticipated their locations. Gunfire echoed across the valley as federal lawmen found themselves outflanked by criminals who'd prepared for exactly this scenario. Eli's Winchester spoke with the authority of 3 generations, its heavy slug catching Morrison's center mass and spinning him around like a child's toy. But Morrison's associates were already moving, one toward the front door, while another circled toward the back of the house, where Mora and Rose remained hidden. "Lily, get down!" Eli shouted as he worked, the Winchester's lever action, chambering another round while scanning for additional targets. The little girl dropped to the floor behind the kitchen table, her small form protected by solid oak that would stop pistol bullets. The front door splintered as one of Morrison's men kicked it open, his pistol raised and ready. But Eli had anticipated. The assault had positioned himself to command the entryway with devastating effect. The Winchester roared again, and Morrison's associate crumpled in the doorway. His threat permanently ended. From the back of the house came the crash of breaking glass and Mara's scream of defiance. The third attacker had found another way inside, was trying to reach the family through the bedroom window. Eli abandoned his position at the front window, racing through the house toward the sound of struggle, Lily's footsteps pattering behind him as she refused to be left alone. He burst into the back bedroom to find Mora grappling with a man twice. Her sighs while Rose cowered in the corner, her young face frozen with terror. The attacker had one arm around Mara's throat, while his other hand reached for Rose, clearly intending to use the child as leverage against any resistance. Eli's shot was instant and precise, the Winchester's bullet ending the threat before the man could harm either of his family members. But the violence had shattered something in the peaceful sanctuary they'd built together, had brought the outside world's cruelty into their safe haven with devastating force. "Is everyone hurt?" he asked, gathering his family into his arms while scanning for additional threats. "We're all right," Mora gasped, her voice shaky but determined. "The twins." "I'm here, Mama," Lily said, appearing in the doorway with her, slingshot now loaded and ready. "I heard the bad man breaking the window, so I came to help." The sight of 8-year-old Lily, prepared to defend her family with nothing but a child's toy and limitless courage, nearly broke Eli's heart. This brave little girl, who'd already survived more trauma than any child should face, was ready to fight again to protect the people she loved. "You're very brave, sweetheart, but the danger's over now." Outside, the gunfire had stopped, replaced by Marshal Hayes's voice, calling for surrender from any remaining attackers. Morrison's criminal enterprise had ended in the ranch yard where it had begun, brought down by the combined force of federal law enforcement and a rancher's determination to protect his family. But as Eli held his wife and daughters close, feeling their hearts beating against his chest, he knew the real victory wasn't in defeating Morrison's organization. The real victory was in the family they'd built together, in the love that had given him strength to fight for what mattered most. They were safe. They were together. They were home. The family photograph would capture this moment forever. Eli, Mora, and the twins standing together on the front porch, where Lily had first drawn them in her sketch months earlier. But first, there were practical matters to attend to, official responsibilities that followed in the wake of violence, even when that violence was clearly justified. Marshal Hayes approached the house with the weary satisfaction of a lawman whose difficult case had finally reached resolution. Morrison lay dead in the ranch yard, his criminal enterprise ended by Eli's Winchester and federal justice. The two associates who'd attempted to storm the house would never threaten another family, their bodies bearing silent testimony to the consequences of purgation. "Clean shooting, Mr. Garner," Hayes said, though his tone carried professional assessment rather than celebration. All three men were armed and clearly attempting to commit violent felonies. Any territorial court will rule this justified defense of family and property. Eli nodded, though the weight of taking human life settled heavily on his shoulders, despite the necessity of his actions. He'd killed before, during his younger years, when frontier justice was sometimes the only justice available, but 15 years of peaceful ranching had softened him to violence's impact. Still, given the same circumstances, he'd make the same choices without hesitation. "What happens now?" Mora asked, keeping the twins close while surveying the damage to their previously peaceful home. The front door hung broken on its hinges. The back bedroom window was shattered, and bullet holes marked the exterior walls where Marshal Hayes's men had engaged Morrison's associates. "Now we clean up this mess and get on with our lives," Hayes replied. "Morrison's network is broken. My deputies have been tracking his associates across 3 territories for the past month, and this was his last operational group. Without his leadership and resources, the remaining criminals will scatter rather than continue his work." "Are you certain?" Eli asked. Morrison seemed to think he had resources we hadn't accounted for. Morrison was a confidence man as much as a criminal organizer. He survived by convincing people he was more powerful and connected than he actually was. Strip away the bluster and forged documents, and he was just another predator exploiting legal loopholes and territorial isolation. Hayes gestured toward the ranch yard, where his deputies were documenting the scene with methodical efficiency. We've recovered Morrison's real financial records from his hotel room in town. His operation was heavily in debt, surviving on credit extended by criminal associates who expected quick returns on their investments. With Morrison dead and his assets seized, there's no money to fund continued operations. The explanation should have been reassuring, but Eli found himself thinking about the other families Morrison had destroyed, the women and children who'd disappeared into his network before federal authorities became involved. Justice for Morrison felt incomplete when his victims remained lost. What about the people he'd already taken? Rose asked, her 8-year-old directness cutting through adult euphemisms to address the core moral issue. The other families, like you? Marshal Hayes knelt to Rose's eye level, his weathered face serious as he addressed her concern. We're going to find them, sweetheart. Morrison kept detailed records of his operations locations, associates, transportation routes. Federal marshals are already following those leads to rescue anyone who can still be saved. And punish the bad men who hurt them? And punish the bad men who hurt them, Hayes confirmed. That afternoon, as Hayes and his deputies completed their investigation and prepared to return to Helena, Eli found himself standing in the ranch yard where Morrison had made his final threats. The violence had ended, but its echoes would linger in this place where his family had nearly been torn apart by forces beyond their control. Mora joined him in the yard, slipping her hand into his with the natural affection of a wife offering comfort to her husband. You saved us, she said quietly. All of us. We saved each other. If you hadn't fought back when that man came through the window, if Lily hadn't been brave enough to help when needed, if Rose hadn't kept her sister calm during the worst of it, any one of us failing might have changed everything. The twins keep asking when things will go back to normal, Mora said, watching their daughters as they helped the federal deputies gather evidence. I'm not sure how to answer that. Eli considered the question seriously. Would there ever be a return to the peaceful routine they'd established before Morrison's arrival? Would the twins be able to play in the yard without checking shadows for hidden threats? Would he and Mora sleep peacefully without listening for sounds that didn't belong? Maybe normal was never the goal, he said finally. Maybe what we're building is something better than normal, a family that's been tested and proven strong enough to survive whatever comes. Pastor Williams arrived as the federal marshals were loading their equipment, drawn by news of the confrontation that had already spread through the county's informal communication network. The elderly minister's face was grave as he surveyed the scene, taking in the evidence of violence that had visited this peaceful ranch. Eli, Mora, came as soon as I heard. Are the children hurt? Physically, no, Mora replied. Emotionally, they're dealing with seeing violence again after months of safety. But they're remarkably resilient. Williams nodded, his pastoral experience having taught him about children's capacity for both trauma and recovery. If you'd like, I could speak with them about what happened here today. Sometimes it helps children to process difficult experiences with someone outside the family. Thank you, Eli said. But I think what they need most right now is to understand that this is over, that they're safe, and that our family is strong. Enough to protect them from anything. As if summoned by their conversation, the twins approached from the barn where they'd been helping Deputy Morrison secure evidence. Both girls moved with the careful attention of children who'd learned to read adult moods for signs of danger, but their faces showed curiosity rather than fear. Papa Eli, Lily said, using the name that had emerged naturally during their months together. Marshal Hayes says the bad men can't hurt anyone else now. Is that really true? It's really true, sweetheart. Morrison and his men are gone forever, and the law is going to make sure no one else continues their work. Good, Rose said with fierce satisfaction. They were mean to Mama and tried to take us away from our home. But they didn't succeed, Mora pointed out. We stayed together, and we're going to keep staying together. That evening, after the federal marshals had departed, and Pastor Williams had offered prayers for their protection and healing, the family gathered in the kitchen for their first meal since the confrontation. The broken front door had been temporarily repaired, the shattered window boarded over, and bullet holes filled with wood putty that would need proper repair later. "Can we still have the party tomorrow?" Lily asked, referring to the delayed celebration they'd planned to mark their official status as a family. "I mean, is everything still happy now?" The question revealed the complexity of children's emotional processing, how joy and trauma could coexist, how celebration might seem inappropriate after violence, how healing required conscious choices about which experiences to emphasize. "Everything is still happy," Eli assured her. "The bad things that happen today don't change the good things we've built together. If anything, they prove how strong our family is." "Besides," Rose added with 8-year-old pragmatism, "we already invited people, and Mama made 3 pies yesterday. We can't waste good pie, because some bad men were stupid enough to pick a fight with Papa Eli." The matter-of-fact assessment drew laughter from the adults, a sound that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Children's ability to find normalcy and joy even after trauma was perhaps their greatest gift to the adults who loved them. Later that night, as Eli and Maura tucked the twins into their shared bed, Rose asked one final question that cut to the heart of everything they'd experienced. "Papa Eli, are you sorry you bought us at that auction? Because of all the trouble we brought with us?" The question revealed fears Eli hadn't known she carried, the devastating possibility that their presence had brought more hardship than happiness to his previously peaceful life. He sat on the edge of their bed, gathering both girls close enough to see the absolute sincerity in his eyes. "Rose, Lily, listen to me very carefully. Buying you at that auction was the best decision I ever made in my entire life. Not because it was easy, but because it brought me the family I never thought I'd have. You didn't bring trouble, you brought love and laughter and purpose to a house that had been empty too long, even though bad men came after us. Especially because bad men came after us. Fighting to protect people you love isn't trouble, it's privilege. It's what families do for each other." Lily traced the pattern on her quilt with one small finger, her expression thoughtful. "Mama says families are people who choose to stay together even when things get hard. Your mama is very wise. And we chose each other, all of us, which makes us a real family in every way that matters." As the twins drifted off to sleep, secure in the knowledge that they were loved and protected, Eli and Maura stepped out onto the front porch where this day's violence had begun. The night was quiet now, peaceful sounds of crickets and distant cattle replacing the echo of gunfire. "Tomorrow we'll take that photograph," Maura said, leaning against his shoulder with the trust of a woman who'd seen her husband's courage tested and proven. "The one Lily drew in her picture, our family together on this porch." "Tomorrow," Eli agreed, wrapping his arms around his wife as stars emerged overhead. "And for all the tomorrows after that." The photograph, when taken, would show more than just 4 people posing for a camera. It would capture the completion of a journey that had begun with a desperate woman and her children standing in an auction ring, and ended with a family that had chosen each other and fought for that choice. When it was threatened dot in Lily's original drawing, the family on the porch had looked content with their life together. The photograph would prove that sometimes, with enough courage and love, art could indeed become reality. The new ranch sign stood proudly at the main gate, its fresh pine boards gleaming with varnish that caught the morning sun. The Garner family ranch replaced the weathered, broken arrow marker that had hung there for 3 generations, symbolizing not just a change in name, but a transformation in purpose and spirit. 6 months had passed since the confrontation with Morrison, and the physical scars of that violence had healed alongside the emotional ones. Eli stood beside the sign with his coffee mug, watching the daily ballet of ranch life unfold around him. Rose emerged from the chicken coop with her gathering basket full of fresh eggs, pausing to offer grain to the rooster, who'd appointed himself guardian of the flock. Her carved animals had become popular enough that Henderson's General Store now displayed them prominently, and she'd begun taking special orders from customers as far away as Helena. Lily was in the garden with Maura, the 2 of them harvesting vegetables for the day's meals while discussing plans for expanding the herb section. Maura's knowledge of folk healing had indeed found a market among local ranchers, her remedies proving particularly effective with livestock ailments that conventional veterinary medicine couldn't address. Word of her skills had spread through the county's informal network, bringing visitors who sought her knowledge for both animals and humans. The transformation of the ranch reflected more than just improved maintenance and expanded operations. It had become a place where people felt welcome, where neighbors stopped by, not just for business, but for conversation and fellowship. The violence that had threatened to destroy their family had instead strengthened their bonds and deepened their connection to the community that had supported them through crisis. Papa Eli, Rose called from the chicken yard. Mrs. Henderson wants to know if you have any more of those carved horses I made. She says a family from Missoula saw them and wants to buy some for their children. Eli waved acknowledgement, marveling again at how quickly his daughters had adapted to their new status as legitimate members of the community. The adoption papers had been finalized 2 months earlier, making their family official in every legal sense. But the emotional bonds had been forged long before bureaucracy caught up with reality. The twins had thrived under the stability and affection of ranch life, growing in confidence and capability with each passing month. Rose's artistic talents had expanded beyond wood carving to include sketching and even some basic painting, while Lily had developed an impressive knowledge of plants and their properties under Maura's tutelage. Both girls could now handle basic ranch chores with competence that impressed visiting neighbors. Most remarkably, they'd learned to sleep peacefully through the night, no longer startled awake by sounds that might herald danger. The nightmares that had plagued their early weeks at the ranch had gradually faded, replaced by dreams of future adventures and possibilities that children should be free to imagine. Tom Brennan's truck appeared on the horizon, raising the dust that announced visitors to anyone paying attention. Eli had learned to appreciate these informal social calls that marked the rhythm of rural life, the way neighbors checked on each other's welfare without making it seem like charity or intrusion. "Morning, Eli," Tom called as he climbed out of his truck. "Martha sent me over to ask about Maura's arthritis remedy. My wife's been struggling with her hands lately, and Doc Peterson's pills aren't helping much." "Maura's got some willow bark extract that might help," Eli replied. "She's been treating it with other herbs that seem to work better than anything the doctor prescribes." They walked toward the garden where Maura was explaining to Lily the difference between medicinal and culinary herbs, her patient instruction revealing the teacher she'd become as much as the healer. The sight of his wife sharing knowledge with their daughter filled Eli with satisfaction that went beyond simple pride. It was the deep contentment of watching purposes fulfilled and potentials realized. "Mrs. Garner," Tom said, tipping his hat with the respectful courtesy that had replaced his initial uncertainty about their unconventional family arrangement. "I hope you don't mind my asking about remedies for joint pain." "Martha's heard good things about your treatments." "I'd be happy to help," Maura replied, wiping soil from her hands before greeting their visitor properly. "Arthritis responds well to natural treatments if they're used consistently. I can prepare a mixture that should provide relief without the stomach upset that comes from patent medicines." As Maura explained the treatment and prepared a sample for Tom to take home, Eli found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. A year ago, he'd been a solitary man convinced that his useful life was effectively over, that his best years lay in the past rather than the future. Now he woke each morning to the sounds of family life, spent his days working alongside people who depended on him and whom he cherished, and went to bed each night grateful for the unexpected gifts that had transformed his existence. The irony wasn't lost on him that what had begun as an act of charity had become the source of his own salvation. By rescuing Maura and the twins from Morrison's criminal scheme, he'd rescued himself from the slow death of isolation and purposelessness that had been consuming him year by year. "Mr. Garner," Lily said, approaching him with a serious expression. She wore when asking important questions. "Mama says we might have a baby brother or sister someday. Is that really possible?" The question caught Eli off guard, though he realized it shouldn't have. Maura was 31, still young enough for children, and their marriage had evolved from convenience to genuine love with a naturalness that surprised them both. The possibility of expanding their family was logical, even probable, but hearing it discussed so matter-of-factly by an 8-year-old made it suddenly real. It's possible, he said carefully. Your mama and I would like to have more children if we're blessed that way. How would you feel about having a baby brother or sister? I think it would be wonderful, Lily replied with the certainty of a child who'd learned that families were sources of joy rather than danger. Rose and I could teach them about chickens and horses and how to carve animals from wood. The casual assumption that they'd be good big sisters, that their family was stable enough to welcome new members, demonstrated how completely the twins had healed from their early trauma. They no longer saw change as a threat to their security, but as an opportunity for new happiness. After Tom departed with Mora's arthritis remedy and the Khan promises to return with reports on its effectiveness, the family gathered on the front porch for the evening routine that had become their favorite part of each day. Eli read aloud from adventure stories, while Mora worked on mending, and the twins practiced their letters or pursued individual creative projects. Papa Eli, Rose said during a pause in the reading, I've been thinking about what I want to be when I grow up. Oh? And what have you decided? I want to be a rancher like you, but also an artist like myself. I want to raise cattle and chickens and grow vegetables, but also make beautiful things that people want to buy. Is it possible to be two different things at once? The question revealed Rose's growing understanding of life's possibilities, her realization that choices didn't have to be exclusive, that talents could be combined rather than sacrificed to single purposes. It was a mature perspective for an 8-year-old, born of watching the adults around her successfully balance multiple roles and responsibilities. It's not only possible, it's probably the best way to live, Eli told her. Your mama is a rancher and a healer. I'm a cattleman and now a father. The most interesting people are usually good at several different things. Good, Rose said with satisfaction, because I like everything we do here, and I don't want to have to choose just one thing to be good at. As twilight settled over the ranch and the twins prepared for bed, Eli found himself standing once again at the spot where Morrison had made his final threats 6 months earlier. But instead of violence and fear, the ranch yard now hosted peaceful evening sounds, cattle lowing in distant pastures, chickens settling for the night, the soft murmur of his family's voices as they concluded their day together. Mora joined him in the yard, slipping her hand into his with a natural affection that had grown between them like prairie grass after rain slowly at first, then with surprising strength and permanence. I have something to tell you, she said, her voice carrying the hint of excitement that preceded important announcements. About the arthritis remedy? Tom seemed impressed with your explanation, not about the remedy. Mora turned to face him directly, her green eyes bright with news she'd been waiting for the right moment to share. About the baby Lily mentioned earlier. She wasn't just speculating about possibilities. The words took a moment to penetrate Eli's understanding, but when they did, he felt the same expansion of heart that had overwhelmed him the day he'd first held the twins in his arms as their legal father. Another child. Another chance to experience the joy of watching someone grow and discover their place in the world. Are you certain? As certain as a woman can be about such things. Dr. Peterson confirmed it yesterday when I went to town for supplies. Mora's smile was radiant with happiness that made her look even younger than her 31 years. I wanted to tell you here, in the place where our family really began. Eli gathered his wife into his arms, holding her close while considering the magnitude of this new blessing. A child conceived in love rather than desperation, born into security rather than uncertainty, welcomed by siblings who would cherish rather than resent the addition to their family. Sarah would have loved this, he said quietly, surprising himself with the observation. She would have loved seeing her house full of children again, loved knowing that her dreams of family weren't lost when she died. I think she's been watching over us all along, Mora replied. How else do you explain the way everything worked out? You being at that auction at exactly the right moment, having the courage to bid when you could have stayed silent, all of you's learning to love each other despite the circumstances that brought us together. Above them, stars emerged in the vast Montana sky, bearing witness to the completion of a journey that had begun with loss and loneliness, but had evolved into something richer and more meaningful than either of them had dared hope. The ranch. That had once been a monument to faded dreams and become the foundation for new ones. A place where love could grow and families could flourish, despite the challenges that life might bring dark in the distance. A coyote sang its ancient song to the night, but the sound no longer seemed lonely or ominous. Instead, it felt like a celebration of wildness and freedom, of the untamed spirit that made Montana beautiful and the courage that made survival possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys. But tonight the Garner family was complete. Gathered under stars that had watched 3 generations of their name work this land. The broken arrow had become a symbol of renewal rather than loss, proof that some endings were actually beginnings in disguise. And in the morning, when the sun rose over their valley and the daily work of ranch life began again, it would shine on a family that had chosen each other and fought for that choice when it was threatened. A family that had learned that love was strong enough to overcome any hardship when it was grounded in respect, commitment, and shared purpose. The circle was complete, but the story would continue for generations yet to come.